introduce our next speaker, Steve Apfelbaum, who is the chairman of Applied Ecological Services, which is based in Wisconsin, but has other offices, and also has the world's largest regenerative nursery.
That's what we're told.
That's what they're told, and now you're told. They've done about 9,000 projects on the land, restoring them. And what that means is if you ask Steve about anything, even the Chesapeake, because he's worked on the Chesapeake, get ready for an answer. Steve, like our other speakers this morning, knows his stuff. Somebody we're all learning from. He teaches this at Harvard University.
That's how they pronounce it.
And, you know, and he's written some seminal books on the subject. And here we go, Steve. Steve Apfelbaum.
So the last time I presented this, I had the honor of co-presenting it with Dr. Richard Teague at the White House. And we were told we had an hour, so we prepared this 48-slide presentation. And when we got there, the Deputy Commissioner of the Office of Science and Technology said, "You've got 20 minutes, we have a security briefing." And I thought, oh shit, a security briefing. That's what we're about to give you, is a security briefing. So bring the State Department folks in. Anyways, what we did was, after years of, do I have to talk into the microphone? After years of trying to bring soil to the fore and have a conversation at the policy level, not just a bunch of crazy scientists like myself, we've been learning from farmers. We've been seeing the results. We had Rodale results. We had results from all over the world that were anecdotal, giving us pieces of information. We began a conversation with several high-level politicians in this country, including the Obama White House. And after 4 years of starting a conversation, we finally, last April, got an invite to present some of the preliminary results from large landscape scale projects. What was interesting is they held us to a 12-minute presentation. Thank you for giving me 45 minutes. And then we had 8 minutes to have a discussion. So today we get to blow the doors off and take this 2 or 3 times as long, hopefully. Dr. Richard Teague and I co-presented, and I wish I could present it with his wonderful South African accent, but I'd muff it up. So what we were trying to do as an agenda was, you've already heard this, let them know that regenerative land management is the vehicle in myriad forms, and whether it be grazing, whether it be aquaculture, every form of agriculture, every form of forestry, every form of land management has a regenerative form that is actually a lot less expensive, a lot easier to deploy. And we wanted to give them examples of that, and give them examples in confidence that photosynthesis, this several billion-year-old process actually, is actually trustable, that the policies of the armchair politics and the decisions made in Washington are a lot less trustable than what nature can be used to teach us. We gave them a very tight agenda, 12 minutes, and we went through what we call low disturbance cropping, which is one example from the Pacific Northwest of 1-pass no-till. It's still an industrial ag, but it's knocking the socks off of 2- and 3-pass no-till in terms of carbon accruals. And we wanted to give them the adaptive multi-paddock grazing story, which is this grazing that's modeled after emulating the way big herds of native ungulates, bison, caribou, wildebeest, and so forth, used to operate on the landscape. And then we wanted to tell them about the data gaps, that we don't understand the socioeconomic drivers well enough. What's the incentive? What's the inducement? What's the trigger to push a farmer or a rancher over the tipping point where they're going to say, oh, I'll do this. I've never tried it before. I'm going to be the laughing stock of the neighborhood. Poor Tim. They're going to laugh at my weeds and laugh at my fat, healthy cattle, but that peer and that socioeconomic driver is a really critical part of the story. And then we wanted to let them know that, the science needs to become more trustable. We've got a series of dots on a map, and that represents the science knowledge that provides credible science, defensible science. We believe, to have that more spread, more dots on the map, in other words. Let me see if I can change this thing. Our research framework was that carbon-rich soil is healthy soil, beneficial for the entire ecosystem. You've already heard from everybody, that healthy ecosystems function by drawing down CO2, and that results in water infiltration, retention, biodiversity at all levels. Soil erosion is reduced or eliminated completely, or nearly so, and improved in the case of livestock and crops, improved yields and improved quality of the plants and reliability and also nutrition of those materials when we eat those materials. Now, this isn't a beauty contest to see who has the fanciest slides to share with you today, but I'd vote for this one, actually. We have about 9 gigatons of emissions that we're emitting now. It's a little higher than that since this slide was made. A split between about half of that, a split about 2.3, 2.5 goes into the ocean currently, and about the same amount into all terrestrial ecosystems, including soil and the life above the soil, including us. About 4 gigatons is the excessive level annually that goes into the atmosphere. So I entered this in the beauty contest also. You can obviously see that there's a lot more carbon in the soils than there is in the atmosphere and in the plants growing on the landscape, but that's dwarfed by what's in the ocean currently. Everybody see I know it's right before lunchtime and your blood sugar's low, but you notice the circles are bigger and the numbers are bigger. So high-powered Shell oil company engineers set on a quest to understand whether investing $8 billion to pump excessive CO2 into the geological strata was really worth it. And most of the engineers we were working with said, no, it's not worth it, but we need an alternative. But they couldn't say that within their company because there's an investment in this huge geological sequestration endeavor. But those engineers with wonderful calculations and spreadsheets and things I wish I knew how to use came up with about the same back of the envelope calculation that Larry came up with within 5 minutes of literally a pencil and an envelope. If you take the average carbon organic carbon stock on the planet, it's around 100 tons of carbon per hectare per year is what's quoted as an average, depending upon what you read. And you increase that by 1%, that's 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year that you would increase it. If you multiply that times the 3.5 billion hectares of grasslands on the planet, that equals around 3.5 gigatons, right? And if you add the billion hectares of agricultural, row crop agricultural landscapes on the planet, and you do that same increase and add it to what you produced on the grasslands, that's around 4.5 billion tons or 4.5 gigatons per year. So the high-powered equation was, wow, what if we could take all that pasture and all that ag land and increase it by just 1 ton per hectare per year? That would remove, this excessive 4 gigatons theoretically. So, that's 3 years worth of calculations, and that was the exciting part of what engaged the engineers. And then the more challenging part was, well, shit, how do we get farmers and ranchers to even care about this or become engaged by this? How do you aggregate? How do you build coordinated networks of people at scale that can get this improvement in the soil done quickly and with some sort of uniformity so that it's reliably being done? And that's been the challenge that we're faced with as scientists now. So we tried, we've got 4 or 5 projects that we're doing all over the world right now. This is one of them. It's a 30 million acre area called the Palouse agro-ecosystem. It was a wonderful historic grassland in eastern Washington state, Idaho, and part of Oregon. and most of it's been converted to wheat production. We'll be eating it over lunch today, I'm sure, in our bread, eating part of the Palouse. What we learned was that there was a large percentage of farmers on this very steep and rolling landscape, very highly erodible landscape, that were still using conventional moldboard tillage, about 30% of the farmers. 25, 30 tons of soil loss per acre per year. Unbelievable. I farm. If I lost that much, I'd feel guilty as hell, because it would be dumping on the neighbors and I'd be profiting them probably, and they'd be chastising me. We set about looking for the best performers, the conservation performers on their landscape, and they were all doing one-pass no-till. They had literally no-till drills with a saw blade, the equivalent of a saw blade, that cut a slot that was 1% to 2% of the landscape in terms of the impact, and the seed and fertilizer and other chemicals that they're still, this is industrial scale ag, they're still adding that material, but with a 1% or 2% change in the soil and the residue, crop residue. We began the process by studying the region, so stratifying the soils, the mineralogy, the geological history, the rainfall patterns, the climate, and then looked at where soil carbon was actually found on this landscape. In the lower left, really high ridges of wind-blown loess, wind-blown silt soil, 300, 500-foot high ridges in some places. Was the carbon found at the organic carbon of the soil found on those high ridges? Was it found on the side slopes? Was it found in the bottom of the drainage ways? And then we set about to sampling that landscape using, I won't bore you with the design of the statistics, but we found out that slope position, let me go back to that, slope position, precipitation aspect, and then the time since a particular tillage technique is being used were the most important variables in determining the amount of carbon on the landscape. And we set about to randomize sampling points over this 30 million acre landscape, and went out there with this piece of equipment. It was a hydraulic soil sampling unit that within about 3 seconds we can pull 1 to 2 meter deep core samples out that are 2 inches in diameter, cap them with plastic caps, put a barcode on it and send it to the lab, and have it fully analyzed all the way down through the 1 to 2 meters. What we did for this particular site is the lab analysis that we had done is on the right. I won't bore you with it. And then the number of samples of each of the different types of or times since low disturbance cropping was put in place are on the left. The other thing we did is we sampled reference natural areas. We wanted to find out what was the legacy of the historic ecosystem here, which isn't done oftentimes. That gives us a sense of what's achievable on this landscape over the past 7,000 years or 10,000 years. What has nature done? So it's another way of honoring the local system. And that gave us a lot of surprising information. We had volcanic eruption, pumice layers, and we could see on top of the Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption. We had nearly 12 inches in new topsoil on top of the Mount St. Helens eruption, pumice layer. And that all happened since 1981. So it gave us date stamps and real interesting opportunities to think differently about that landscape. What we learned was on this landscape that we were finding very highly significant in accruals of soil organic carbon, and I'll show you what those were. Where low disturbance cropping was occurring, where 2 and 3 pass no-till was occurring, the rate of accrual of organic carbon was about 1/3 of that we were measuring with low disturbance cropping. And conservation tillage was negative, and moldboard plowing, just like Tim showed, was seriously negative. About 2 tons of carbon per hectare per year being lost with moldboard plowing, and about 1.8 tons being lost with conservation tillage. So a marginal improvement with chisel plowing and other conservation tillage improvements. And then just barely on the positive side of the scale with 2 and 3 pass no-till. And then about 1.3 tons per hectare per year of accruals with the low disturbance cropping. Why are we doing this project? We want to make a demonstration of how to incentivize farmers, or in the next example, ranchers, to care about soil carbon and give it a place of honor in their daily life and daily routine of farming and ranching. So the baseline scenario of the moldboard plowing and conservation tillage would be represented by that red line. You see a decreasing quantity of organic carbon. And the green line is supposed to be just a stylized example, a graphic showing the improved carbon levels that are occurring under the slow disturbance cropping. What that translates to is real money, and I won't bore you with that. What it translates to in the marketplace, when you translate the amount of carbon into the currency of the carbon marketplace, which isn't the tons of carbon, it's the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So all the greenhouse gases are converted into an equivalency into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. What we have done, and this is the poster that our partner Native Energy used at a no-till conference in Washington State, we used this poster to enroll farmers. And we now have about 500,000 acres of farmers enrolled. And the farmers in the green zone, hopefully you can see the colors where you're at, are accruing statistically between about 5 and about 7 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. And those in the yellow zone, which are the drier areas, are accruing less. We have a buyer that's willing to pay $6 to $10 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. We're going to do, hopefully in 2017, what will be one of the first measured carbon transactions on the planet, where we're actually measuring, not just doing a behavior change, where if you change from conventional tillage to conservation tillage, there's a presumption that there's an improvement. Everything we're doing is statistically based on a standard method that you could read about if you have insomnia and you want to really fall asleep quick. Go to the Verified Carbon Standard and look up the Earth Partner Soil Carbon Quantification Method. It's a light read of about 120 pages of calculations. Have fun. So the second project we'll talk about is grazing. And I think I'm learning that it doesn't matter what sort of animals you're grazing, that it could be sheep, it could be giraffes, it could be amoebas. I'm really, really optimistic, and I'm very hopeful. I think it's even chickens and turkeys, depending upon how they're managed. And that is of relevance to the Chesapeake Bay. What we've done here is follow Dr. Richard Teague's lead, and his lead is that 90% of what happens, and David Johnson is on our science team. What a wonderful joy to work with somebody that doesn't know everything, but reports with humility what these crazy findings he's having. We're learning that about 90% of everything that occurs on the land appears to be mediated by soil microbes and soil fungi. And the relationship between those two groups changes, and it really makes a difference who's the dominant in terms of the percentages, in terms of carbon storage and durability of that carbon. Richard says, and this is me speaking in a very distinguished South African style here, the energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, and the plant community, animal community dynamics have to be restored to be able to achieve the carbon benefits and all the co-benefits that you've heard about here: water, biodiversity, improve food quality, quantity, and so forth and so on. So he shows this wonderful slide of a project he worked on in Sonora, Mexico. It was overgrazed on the left using what's called continuous grazing, where you just let the cattle out every day and they go to the same plants they like eating and probably defecate on the plants they don't like eating, and everything degrades is the whole point. So you end up with a site that's a net emitter of greenhouse gases, CO2, and also exports water as a waste product. Imagine that. 10 years later, this is the exact same site, I'm assured by Dr. Teague. 10 years later, without the addition of anything other than a lot more cattle, grazed for a very short period of time and then moved off to allow an adequate recovery period, That's the only addition here I'm assured of, or the only change, and it converted, by stimulating the seed bank, and converted the very desert-like experience you see on the left into what you see on the right. Very completely different, change in albedo, which is reflectivity, photosynthetic area that's producing all sorts of life at all layers, not just the plants that you're seeing there. That's what adaptive multi-paddock grazing is, according to him, where you're utilizing the land more efficiently. And he shows this wonderful example of where he radio collared with GPS tags cattle on a ranch of around, I don't remember the acreage, a couple thousand acres. And you could see that the cattle, the green dots in other words, if you're following me, are following low areas and being very, they're only utilizing a very small percentage of the ranch. And they're consuming day in and day out that small percentage of the ranch, the plant material produced on that. What he did on a project like this to reduce overgrazing, and then he clarified what overgrazing was, and I had no idea, I'm not a livestock guy, he clarified that overgrazing has nothing to do with the number of animals. It's the exposure of those animals to the plants. So I like his little saying, 1 cow grazing on 10 acres all season can kill thousands of plants, but 1,000 cows grazing the same acre for 1 day will not kill a single plant. So he's like buffalo herds, sweeping those animals through quickly and then allowing that recovery. And this was a real clarifying opportunity for me. As a backpacker in the West, I used to disparage the cow turds all over the trails. Now I don't appreciate them still, but I don't disparage them as much. So by breaking a ranch into smaller paddocks and adding more cattle and utilizing the paddocks more fully, but quickly, moving through quickly, he's achieved the results that I'll talk about here in a minute. One of the projects that they've worked on is in northern Texas, you can see there, and I'm going to go through very quickly because you're probably not interested in hearing the same details again. What he's learned is that about 3 tons of additional carbon, organic carbon per hectare per year, was being put into these soils through this grazing technique compared to conventional continuous grazed heavy and light stocked ranches right across the fence. So just a stunning epiphany on why we still can find the old paths of the buffalo across North America and why those landscapes still have higher carbon levels than the areas that were not frequently traveled by the buffalo. All the co-benefits, decreased bare ground, increased soil physical structure, improved fertility, soil microbial composition improvements, water holding capacity improvements, and so on, you've already heard about. We're all part of the findings of that study. So now I'll talk about a study we did in Alberta. We thought we have to replicate Richard Teague's study, and let's go to Canada. It's cooler, we don't have to sweat during the summer. There's a lot of mosquitoes, we'll learn how to swat those. So we chose 4 ecoregions, you can see on the left there, and then we chose 4 amp grazing ranches that have been doing this adaptive multi-paddock grazing for 20 years or more. You can see the stars showing the locations. The ecoregions ranged from the foothills to the Rockies out to really dry sandy soils on glacial outwash and windblown sand plains east of the Rockies. The first thing we did was we brought in soil scientists to confirm the soil descriptions that were on each of on the AMP ranches, and then we went across the fence and tried to convince neighboring ranchers to let us do the same studies on their ranch. We found out that we couldn't say we're going to compare you to your neighbors. They didn't like that idea of being compared. When we offered them really high quality aerial photographs of their farms and ranches, they were all over it and said, yeah, we'll participate. And then when we told them we would give them the soils data, they wow, we're going to get real data from real scientists? You bet. So we gave them that, and we had wonderful comparisons that came together. on the same soil katinas, so the same geomorphic landforms, the same soil conditions, the same history in most cases, with the exception of the change from conventional grazing to this amp grazing, which occurred about 20 years before the study was done. And we went through and randomly sampled, my hand's not long enough, randomly sampled soils along transects that were randomized, and the samples were collected to a meter depth with this Gittings unit. The other thing we did, which we always wanted to do, there's a new type of infiltration measurement machine. You know what a perk test is? You know, if you're putting a house in, the local septic guy digs a hole and fills it with water and, you know, puts a stopwatch on or her and measures the rate at which the water goes down in the hole without any eye toward what the antecedent conditions were. You know, was it really rainy for 3 weeks or was it bone dry? This little device in the upper right is like an upside down pressure cooker that plugs into the ground. And the first thing it does is it 100% saturates the soil. And then the next thing it does, by applying constant head pressures of different depths of water, it drives it tests different infiltration conditions under 100% saturation. So Tim, I was telling you, Gabe Brown's infiltration measurements based on this have gone up by nearly a third. So he has that data. I don't have an updated slideshow with that data. Well, it's important if you're wanting to know about water infiltration to know what it's really like under saturated conditions, not what it's like under bone dry conditions. That's what this device gives us. So 8-inch diameter hole, and on some soils we were pouring 50 gallons of water down the hole before it was 100% saturated. So just amazing experiment that we did. I was very pleased to learn about how heavy water is because we had to carry buckets of water. The other thing we did with Dr. Christian Davies from Shell Oil Company is we bought a $10,000 tube of carbon-13 isotope, and we pulsed these areas in the plastic tents that you see, a little squirt of the carbon-13 isotope, and then for a period of 7 weeks, about 9 weeks, continuously measured where that carbon-13 went through the ecosystem. Most, my understanding, Christine and others know, most of the air we breathe, the CO2 we breathe, is carbon-12 isotope, like 98%. By pulsing with carbon-13 isotope, which was 98% carbon-13, we were able to trace and determine where that carbon went. So the plants photosynthesizing would take it up, and then the insects eating the plants would end up with the carbon-13, and the bacteria and the fungi and the roots would end up with it. One of the most fascinating preliminary results, and I hope we have the final results in a few weeks, is we're also measuring methane emissions and N2O and other emissions, including when big herds of cattle came through. And what we measured, and I'm not here to report that it's final yet, so let me be clear about that. We measured 100% of the methane that was being released in real time by the cattle, being in real time, within minutes, being absorbed by methanotropes in the soil. So this is a game changer if this is true because of the ruminant methane argument. This may be some of the first data to suggest that healthy soil contains methanotropes, methane microbes that make their living by breaking apart the carbon-hydrogen bonds in methane, get their energy from that. If this is true, this is a remarkable discovery with this one little tiny pissant project. So we're hoping to, which we're now replicating. So we should have complete mass balance of carbon pools and carbon-13 fate within the next couple of weeks. And I can't wait to see that. So what Richard would say is the amp grazing pastures, paddocks in the lower left, compared to the high-density continuous grazed, HCG, and light continuous grazed, are starkly different in the way they look. But when you start measuring them, the energy flow, water cycle, mineral cycle, and community plant-animal dynamics are completely different. This is a young, the AMP grazed is a young, continuously, vigorously growing system that's photosynthesizing like mad, to use Alan Williams' term. And the system, the HCG and the LCG, have a lot of residual uneaten plant material, and they're not nearly as productive. So what we measured was soil carbon accrual rates in Alberta, for God's sakes. Cold, forbidden, short growing season, Alberta was about 1.4 to about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year additional, where this AMP grazing was occurring compared to heavy continuous grazing. And let me just show you the soil infiltration story, which blew me away. Soil on the left is heavy continuous. Soil on the right is a 10-year shift to AMP grazing. And let me just emphasize it with this. In the sandy loam soils, which are unbelievably rapid infiltration soils, we statistically measured an improvement of about a half an inch per hour, which is remarkable in a sandy soil. But in clay soils, heavy clay soils, 10 to the minus 7, 10 to the minus 9 centimeter per second permeability soils, which are like parking lots, we were measuring around 10 to 12 inches per hour of additional infiltration. So this is a remarkable understanding to actually have that sort of measurement. The other thing that we learned is not all green is green. And we learned, for example, that planted pastures of C3 grasses, these annual polycultures, are putting a lot of carbon in the upper 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters, but it's only the deep-rooted plants, native C4 grasses and other native C3 grasses, that are driving the carbon, down to a meter or more in depth. And that really is a detail that is being missed within the conversation now. So if you want durable carbon, the deeper and the farther it is, typically the farther it is away from the variable and dynamic surface, the more recalcitrant it is. It's not necessarily a different fraction of carbon, it's where the carbon's located in the soil system. So Richard and Ratan Lal are going to Paris next week to present a different way of thinking about carbon with this with the Paris Accord. What we're measuring in North Dakota is about 1.1% of carbon accrual per year additional. At Alan Williams Ranch in Mississippi, we've been measuring about 2.1% improvements. Richard in Texas measured about 1.7% improvements. And we're suggesting that the 0.4%, is leaving an awful lot on the table. I think I won't even talk about this, but this is in a paper that we came out with in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation, which apparently was the most downloaded paper that journal has ever experienced. That really flips the story over about how ruminants are part of the solution rather than a potential threat to the planet. And I think with that, so we believe that our hypothesis of AMP grazing improving ranch economics, water resilient, reduced soil erosion, biodiversity, and so forth is likely, as we continue doing this research, to be documented, to be a potential real conclusion. And I think with that, we're embarking on a 1 gigaton demonstration right now. And we're about to begin fundraising for a 1 gigaton demonstration. That would be about 150 million acres of land involved in this sort of grazing. We could talk about that more if you want. So I think, thank you.